EVO. Buffalo, New York, September 6th, 1901. The Pan-American Exposition is the greatest World's Fair the United States has ever staged. A celebration of electricity, of industry, of a nation that has just won a war, annexed territories on two oceans, and is standing for the very first time at the threshold of genuine global power. The fairgrounds glow at night with 100,000 electric lights, an almost supernatural spectacle for an era when most of the country still burns kerosene. The centerpiece is the electric tower, 380 feet of illuminated architecture, visible for miles in every direction, the physical embodiment of a country that has decided it is the future. President William McKinley is here to greet the public. He loves this. He's always loved this. A handshake line. An open reception at the Temple of Music, where any citizen could walk in off the fairgrounds and shake the hand of the President of the United States. His secretary, George Cortelyou, has tried 3 times to cancel this particular appearance on reasons of security. The fairgrounds are crowded, the space is confined, the geometry's wrong. McKinley overrules him every time. He will not be kept from the American people by hypothetical danger. He's been standing in the reception line for 12 minutes when a young man approaches with his right hand wrapped in a white bandage, as though concealing an injury. He's 28 years old. His name is Leon Czolgosz. The bandage conceals a .32 caliber Iver Johnson revolver. When he reaches McKinley, he fires twice before a single Secret Service agent can move. McKinley falls. He looks at his secretary, and his first words are not about himself. His first words are, "Cortelyou, be careful how you tell my wife." By the end of this episode, you'll understand not just who William McKinley was and why he was killed, but why the man who stepped into his shoes was the single most consequential accidental president in American history. And soon we'll discover what the bullet that killed the last gentleman of the Gilded Age actually built. Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is the Handshake line, the assassination of William McKinley. Episode 1, The Last Gentleman. If you enjoy historical storytelling like this, please follow the podcast wherever you listen and find us on social media at the Ides of April Pod and on the EVO Creative YouTube channel. It costs you nothing and it sustains everything. Now, on with the show. Chapter 1 begins. The Major. In Henry IV, Shakespeare gives his aging king a line that has become one of the most quoted observations about the loneliness of power. Lying sleepless while his kingdom churns beneath him, the king says simply, "Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." It's not a statement about fear or inadequacy. It's a statement about the specific and inescapable weight of responsibility, the way that genuine authority, honestly held, keeps a man awake at night because he understands what it costs. William McKinley understood what things cost. He'd understood it since he was 18 years old and a private in the Union Army, standing in the blood-soaked cornfields of Western Maryland on the bloodiest single day in the history of American warfare. McKinley's regiment was in the thick of the fighting at Antietam, and McKinley came under heavy fire when bringing rations to the men on the line. Let that image settle for a moment. September 17, 1862, the Battle of Antietam. 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. The cornfield at the center of the battlefield changes hands 6 times before noon. The bodies pile up in the sunken road, Bloody Lane, so densely that soldiers walk on them rather than around them. In the middle of this, a 19-year-old commissary sergeant named William McKinley loads a wagon with hot coffee and warm food and drives it 2 miles to the front lines through active fire and personally serves every man in his regiment. General Hayes wrote of the incident, From his hands, every man in the regiment was served with hot coffee and warm meats, a thing that had never occurred under similar circumstances in any other army in the world. He passed under fire and delivered with his own hands these things, so essential for the men for whom he was laboring. This is who McKinley was before he was anything else. Not a strategist, not a philosopher, a man who drove a wagon through artillery fire because the men on the line were hungry, and he was the one who could fix it. McKinley was the last president to have served in the American Civil War. He was the only one to begin his service as an enlisted man and end it as a brevet major. He came out of that war with a specific and unshakable understanding of what ordinary Americans were capable of, their endurance, their humor, their willingness to sacrifice, and a devotion to them that would define his entire political career. He returned to Ohio, he studied law, he was admitted to the bar in 1867, and opened a law office in Canton, where he resided, except for his years in Washington, for the rest of his life. He married Ida Saxton, the daughter of a Canton banker, and the two of them suffered what no parent should have to suffer. The couple had 2 daughters, but neither reached adulthood. The losses broke Ida's health permanently. She developed epilepsy. McKinley's devotion to her, through decades of illness, was by every account genuine, patient, and complete. Not the performance of a politician's marriage, but the quiet constancy of a man who meant what he said about loyalty. He entered Congress in 1877, became governor of Ohio, and then, with the muscular assistance of his most important ally, positioned himself for the presidency. That ally was Mark Hanna, an Ohio industrialist of vast wealth and vaster political ambition, who recognized in McKinley something rare. A man who was genuinely liked by everyone who met him, who could speak to a factory worker and a railroad baron in the same afternoon and leave both feeling understood. With the help of Hanna, and especially his money, McKinley won the presidential nomination easily. The 1896 campaign against William Jennings Bryan was one of the most consequential in American history, the battle between the industrial future and the agrarian past. And McKinley won it decisively, campaigning from his front porch in Canton while Hanna's machine spent unprecedented sums on his behalf. He was president now, the last gentleman of the Gilded Age, and the world was about to hand him a war that he didn't want. Chapter 2. Fred Nobody. Leon Czolgosz had a second name. He used it when he needed to disappear, when he was blacklisted from his factory job and needed to find new work without his name following him. He managed to get his job back the following year using a different name, Fred Niemann. The Polish-German surname translates as nobody. Fred Nobody. It's one of the more devastating self-descriptions in the history of American political violence. And yet, that Czolgosz chose it himself tells you almost everything you need to know about the psychological landscape that he was operating in. Leon Frank Czolgosz was born in Detroit, Michigan on May 5, 1873. He was the 4th of 8 children born to a Polish-American family. His father was an immigrant laborer. His family moved repeatedly, Detroit to Pennsylvania to Cleveland, following the industrial work that was the only life available to men like them in the America of the 1880s and 1890s. Leon eventually found work in a glass factory outside Pittsburgh, then a wire mill in Cleveland. He was a good worker. He was, by all accounts, quiet, intelligent, and increasingly consumed by the gap between what the country said it was and what he experienced it to be every day on the factory floor. Wage cuts, strikes, tensions between mill workers and owners convinced Czolgosz that the system was rigged against the poor. This was not paranoia. It was observation. The 1890s were a decade of staggering economic violence against American workers. The Homestead Strike of 1892, in which Carnegie Steel hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to break a union with rifles and bayonets, killing workers on the banks of the Monongahela River. The Pullman Strike of 1894, in which President Cleveland sent federal troops against railroad workers, resulting in 30 deaths and the imprisonment of labor leader Eugene Debs. The Panic of 1893 itself, which cost Czolgosz his factory job and from which he never fully recovered, economically or psychologically. The experience left him disaffected, and he increasingly focused on inequality between the wealthy and the workers. In 1898, he quit his job. Some sources claim he had a nervous breakdown and settled on the family's farm. He read, he grew isolated, he grew inward. He developed what the era called neurasthenia, in what we would today recognize as severe depression, a condition that several doctors who examined him after the assassination noted clinically, and that the prosecution chose to dismiss in the interest of a speedy trial. He found anarchism in the way desperate men find desperate ideologies, not through rigorous intellectual engagement, but through the specific and personal recognition that this language named what he felt. He reportedly developed a fascination with anarchist Gaetano Bresci, who fatally shot Umberto I of Italy over the king's repressive policies. A man who killed a king, a man who acted, a man who, unlike Fred Nobody, left a mark. On May 6, 1901, Czolgosz traveled to Cleveland to hear Emma Goldman make a speech at the Federal Liberal Club. Afterwards, Czolgosz spoke briefly to Goldman. He also followed her back to Chicago and attended other meetings where she made speeches on anarchism. Goldman was electric in person, passionate, brilliant, uncompromising. Czolgosz was transfixed. But the movement that Goldman represented was not transfixed by Czolgosz. His obsessive interest in secret societies and his social awkwardness raised red flags among his new anarchist friends. In their newspaper, Free Society, the following announcement was published. Attention! The attention of the comrades is called to another spy. The movement he had staked everything on had formally disowned him. He was alone again. He was Fred Nobody again. And he had already decided what he was going to do about it. Soon we'll understand exactly how a man with a gun, a bandaged hand, and 11 minutes in a public handshake line reached the President of the United States. But first, the man waiting in the wings. Chapter 3. The Madman in the Anteroom. In the spring of 1899, Theodore Roosevelt delivered a speech in Chicago called The Strenuous Life. It is one of the most remarkable political documents in American history, not because it's subtle or nuanced, but because it's neither of those things. Roosevelt says precisely what he believes with the full force of a man who has never in his life felt the need to soften a conviction for an audience. He argues that the great danger facing America is not foreign enemies or economic instability, but comfort. The preference for ease over effort, for safety over risk, for the quiet life over the strenuous one. He argues that nations, like men, must exert themselves or decay. He argues that the United States has a specific and God-given obligation to project its power into the world, to bring what he calls civilization to the peoples of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. He uses language that is imperial in its assumptions and racial in its foundations, and he makes no attempt to conceal either quality. This is the full picture of Theodore Roosevelt, held honestly, without flinching. The man who would become arguably the greatest American president of the 20th century was also a man who believed explicitly and publicly in a hierarchy of races and a doctrine of American civilizational superiority that provided the intellectual scaffolding for every imperial adventure that followed. Both things are true. The evidence demands both. What made Roosevelt unlike anyone else in American politics was not his ideology. There were plenty of imperialists and plenty of progressives in 1901. What made him unlike anyone else was the specific and almost frightening combination of intellectual firepower, physical courage, and absolute refusal to be managed, and this had characterized him since childhood. Boss Platt knew that something had to be done with the governor before he completely destroyed the Republican state machine. Consulting with Mark Hanna, Platt conspired to kick Roosevelt upstairs to the vice presidency in 1900, because this would keep Roosevelt from running for a second term in New York. It was the most consequential miscalculation in the history of American politics. They were trying to bury him, to sideline him. What they actually did was position him 42 yards from the most powerful office on earth, separated from it by a single human life, a heartbeat away. Mark Hanna once exclaimed to a room full of party leaders, "Don't any of you realize there's only one life between this madman and the presidency?" Hanna was not speaking hyperbolically. He meant it as a warning. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent decades building a political machine, that Roosevelt in the White House would be the end of that machine, the end of the comfortable arrangement between industrial capital and government that had defined the Gilded Age and made men like Hanna enormously powerful. He was right. He just couldn't do anything about it. By the summer of 1901, Theodore Roosevelt was 42 years old, Vice President of the United States, and constitutionally irrelevant. He had no portfolio, he had no authority, no role beyond attending to the health of a president who appeared to be in excellent health. He was hiking in the Adirondacks that September, far from Buffalo, far from the Pan-American Exposition, far from the Handshake line where McKinley was about to stand. He was also, without knowing it yet, 48 hours from the presidency. McKinley believed in the American people with a faith that was almost theological in its depth and consistency. He'd driven a wagon through artillery fire at Antietam because they were hungry. He had shaken tens of thousands of hands across 2 decades of public life because he believed the distance between a president and a citizen should be as small as possible. He had overruled his secretary's security concerns 3 times because to do otherwise would be to admit that the republic he had fought for was not what he believed it to be. That faith was not naive. It was tested. It had been forged in the bloodiest single day in American history and had survived everything the Gilded Age could throw at it. But it could not survive a young man from Cleveland with a bandaged hand and nothing left to lose. The America that McKinley believed in, the America of the front porch and the handshake line, of tariffs and reconciliation, of gradual and decent progress, was about to be replaced by something larger, louder, and considerably more dangerous to the existing order of the world. And soon, in the next episode, we'll learn exactly what that replacement cost and what it built. The 8 days McKinley spent dying, the medical catastrophe that may have killed him as surely as the bullet, the messenger climbing a mountain in the Adirondacks, and the moment Mark Hanna looked at what his own machine had produced and said what everyone else was already thinking. That damned cowboy is President of the United States. That's next week on the Handshake line on the Ides of April. The Ides of April is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For the Ides of April, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.